I was a racist. I found certain races to be untrustworthy, repugnant even, and held other beliefs which would have offended and shocked, which would have, if publicly stated, led to my termination from my workplace, and ostracization from my friends. I won't detail or even hint at these views, both for time and to avoid the possibility of some impressionable person taking them to heart, or radicalizing some burgeoning bigot. All you need to know is that I was solidly, arrogantly racist, until last night. I was working late at the office last night there of my own volition, wanting to get a head start on next week's workflow so that I could ease into the week rather than be overwhelmed by it. Another man, of a race to which I do not belong, had also chosen to stay late, apparently for this same reason. Our desks were near each other, although his faced away from mine, so that I could see him but he could not see me. I'd never spoken directly to this man, technically being of a different department, our workspace housed close together out of spatial necessity, rather than departmental design. I didn't know his name, either, and we each typed away, aware of each other, but having no reason nor desire to speak. It was about 8:15 p.m. when we heard the noises. The office officially closed at 6 p.m., and the lingerers usually departed about half an hour after that. The cleaning crew had arrived at 7 p.m., and with our building being well on the smaller side, they managed to complete their duties by 8 p.m. I was certain that they had left. The head of their staff had kindly announced her departure, and I also knew that the only remaining people were myself and the unamiable co-worker ahead of me. The noises, which I had heard from down a dark corridor ahead of us, and which my co-worker had also heard judging by his glance in that direction, seemed unnatural. And by unnatural, I mean in the sense that they were not the sounds of a building to which we were accustomed, they were not the hum or occasional chirps of a server, nor were they the thunderous sounds of the cycling air conditioning. They sounded as if something had first landed on the thinly carpeted floor, and proceeded to thrash about, relentlessly, limbs and appendages colliding with walls, slapping against the floor, while some orifice emitted a sort of belching sound. It was very disconcerting, and I immediately sensed something sinister about it. My co-worker, apparently of a hardier or less perceptive stock than I, had not heeded the danger in those noises that I had. He continued working, adjusting his earphones to maximize their volume. Wanting to get on with my work so that I could go home and rest, I decided to ignore the sounds as well. But apparently the source of the sound had chosen to take interest in the two other occupants of the building. At this point my racism shows itself. I had put in noise-canceling earphones of my own, and was working steadily, when another sound interrupted the artificial silence I had established. Looking up from my work, I saw that the man had unplugged his earphones and was letting his music play aloud. This music, which I immediately recognized as popular with his race, was playing intolerably loud, intolerably so for me, at least. I was instantly infuriated. I found it to be extremely inconsiderate, and some deeper, still fearful part of me wanted the music to be shut off so the source of that other noise wouldn't hear us in the office space. I got up from my desk, marched over to the man, and demanded with only the bare minimum professionalism that his music be shut off or considerably lowered. He was markedly surprised by my response. Apparently, he hadn't known that I was working behind him. He apologized and told me that his Bluetooth earphones had died, and didn't think there was anyone else in the building to be bothered by his music. My anger was almost diminished, but I was still feeling indignant, and I now of course realize it was because I had looked like a dramatically outraged fool. So, as I returned to my desk, I muttered out a phrase which I won't repeat here that suggested his music was of a quality only enjoyable by less than intelligent people. He had just turned down his music as I said this, so he heard it, and boy, did that set him off. His reaction was completely justified, of course. I imagined I'd be just as pissed if someone had said something similar to me, in a professional setting, after I'd just complied with their request. He had every right to be upset, but I didn't realize that at the time, didn't think he had any right to react the way he did to me, After I'd put up with his kind all my life. You see my odious mindset at the time, no doubt. He walked over to me, fuming, and asked me to repeat what I had said. So, I did. Said it right to his face, as I looked him dead in the eyes. He barked out an expletive, and I fired one right back, and once that preliminary exchange had finished, we were on the floor, two adults in their early 30s, wrestling around like school children. Eventually, after two overturned desk chairs, a spilled bottle of whiteout, and a flurry of papers, the bout was ended by our simultaneous recognition that something was not right. We quickly untangled ourselves, and sat up, both barely managing to quiet our panting. Despite the anger which had swelled within us both, we were equally unprepared for physical confrontation on a Thursday night. Listening, warily side-eyeing each other, we tried to discern what exactly had changed during our confrontation. I realized it first, and against my spitefulness, spoke up about it. The noise. I didn't say anything beyond that, was afraid to, honestly. And I didn't have to. Yeah. It's gone. His breathy response confirmed that he had in fact heard it earlier. But that's not all, right? He turned away as he said this, peering into the darkness across the office, towards the corridor from which we'd heard the noise. I listened first for any traces of the sound, but heard nothing of it. Then I tried to listen to the general ambience of the office, and realized with sudden horror that there wasn't one. The soft hum of machinery had ceased, or had been muted by something. It was as if these normal sounds had been overridden by the unnatural one, and together they'd gone into some auditory oblivion. Fear having displaced our anger, we both began inching away from the ominous soundlessness, even though we couldn't have explained why at the time. Despite this eerie phenomenon, the darkness which had hidden the source hadn't increased. We still saw the other desks and terminals across the room. The fact that visibility hadn't been depleted was somehow worse, suggesting that the source was either invisible, and moving closer without detection, or that it was growing, feeding on the atmosphere through which sound was carried. By the time we got to my desk farther away than his, the soundlessness had completely left the confines of the corridor and had made its way halfway across the room, nearly overtaking his desk. And by his desk, I mean the music that was still audibly playing from his phone, which sat on the desk's surface. We inched farther away, and the impression of the presence came closer. We witnessed it consume the music, eat it up until it couldn't be heard at all. We of course saw nothing, but the experience was nonetheless frightening. What made things worse was that the phone itself appeared fine. The screen was still aglow, and we saw nothing which would have been a physical representation of sudden disrepair. It had simply been muted, by some imperceptible presence or force. We had unwittingly backed into the reception area, and in our retreat, we'd momentarily forgotten our mutual animosity. But being in a different room, even though no actual door existed to separate them, was to us both enough of a distinction to warrant the return of our feud. My mind worked to somehow blame the arrival and diffusion of that unsettling presence on him, and I'm sure his mind worked through a similar process. We scowled at each other, and I was the first to speak, saying, "See what you did. Your music attracted it. All you had to do was turn that shit down." His rebuttal was mostly expletives and incredulous huffing, and I responded with the unbeatable argumentative maneuver of mimicry. Two adults stood across from each other, conducting schoolyard antics, while some noise-devouring thing crept across the office. I think we would have gone to blows again, if we hadn't heard it approaching from the doorway opposite the one through which we'd come. I say approaching, but what I mean is that the ambient sounds which had once been present through that way were slowly but steadily being muted. The enveloping of noise was slower this way, as if the thing, whatever it was, had stretched itself throughout and around the building in a U-shape to trap us within the reception area. Being hot-tempered men, we hadn't in our rage thought to do the sensible thing, which would have been to simply leave the reception area altogether through the stairway which led down to the building's foyer, and from there the exit. No, instead we deduced that the space from which we'd come still had more noise, more auditory freedom than the space towards the thing's latest approach, so we fled back into our office space. I followed the man who had taken a de facto lead into a conference room within that greater room, walled off by glass windows and a door. Through its bare transparency we saw nothing out of the ordinary, but could still feel the advance of some ineffable presence. As it encroached upon the room, I tried to steel myself against the deletion of sound which in the room amounted to the hum of a small fan that had been left alone to allow for the speedy drying of recently cleaned surfaces. I was prepared, or wanted to feel that I was prepared, for the entrance of the entity, and had momentarily forgotten that I occupied the room with another person. "What's your name, man?" My co-worker's voice seemed so loud, and that animal panic which had internally wanted for him to be quiet reared up again. I quickly responded with the answer, and the habits of common courtesy with which I'd been instilled at a young age forced me to ask for his. "It's Jeff. Is this it? Am I going to die here at work next to some racist?" His words were intoned with defeat, and his accusation regarding my character, which I didn't internally deny, didn't offend me at the moment like it normally would have. The fact that my sole human companion in that moment had not only admitted defeat, but posited that the deletion of sound within our room would somehow bring about our deaths was supremely unnerving. Any resolve I'd managed to muster was utterly dispersed at that moment, and a panic settled upon me. The soundlessness, detected by the muting of the air conditioning just outside the room, had finally reached us. There was no shimmering or vibrating in the panes of glass as it passed through. The air did not seem to grow heavier, the dim lights did not grow dimmer. But the fan, spinning audibly a few moments ago, was rendered soundless as the presence eased itself into the room. The blades continued to spin, but they and the mechanisms which powered them ceased to emit noise. Terror formed in my heart and bled into my veins. This circulation of fright froze me in place. Jeff, once standing beside me, had moved to the corner of the room. Despite the circumstances, the racism which had poisoned my mind was relentless, as it always is, with those of extreme ignorance, and I saw his pointless retreat as grand cowardice, one born entirely of his racial composition. I knew that there was no escaping this terror, whatever it was, so I did what I felt a white man facing his end should do: stand my ground against an insurmountable horror. It was one last gesture of defiance, the exhibition of courage in the face of certain death, something I conjecture only consistently possible by those of white stock. I even managed to shrug away my petrification. This boldness which had briefly entered my heart was eradicated the moment I felt the sound-erasing presence envelop me. In the few instances before it touched me, I could hear my heartbeat, my breathing, the gastrointestinal processes within my midsection attempting to halt themselves as my body prepared to be assaulted. All these things I had heard, but when the presence touched me, they were all muted. My thoughts were as well. The inner voice, which at its most active we sense we can almost hear, was utterly silenced. I was rendered wholly mute, physically and mentally, and it was the most abysmal sensation I'd ever felt. My burning lungs were the first indication that I had started screaming, the second was Jeff, who had covered his ears against the raucous of my hysteric wailing, he, still being able to hear in his little corner pocket of audibility. I feel that I have not adequately described the total nullity of sound within and without myself, because I haven't ever really considered the importance of being heard. Even if I had no intention of talking to anyone around me at any given moment, it was the freedom to do so that was important. But to be silenced, so completely and irreversibly, it was mind-breaking. I shed my civility and maturity and restrained all at once all those things which I had believed constituted my whiteness. I became no more civilized than an animal roaring in bestial fright upon realizing that it had been ensnared by a predator. The soundlessness passed through me and converged on Jeff, who shrank away from it meekly, and did not flail about or anything too dramatic as I had. When it touched him, he seemed to almost submit to it, but he soon after displayed the same wild behavior as my own, and I felt a dread unlike anything imaginable at seeing this man's helplessness. His eyes shed tears, and looked frantically around the room, as if hoping to spot something which could provide some visual representation of sound. When they landed on me, I felt a powerful kinship with him, a feeling which would have been completely alien just minutes before. Submerged in that inaudibility, the only thing I wanted was to hear this man's voice, for him to hear mine, and to speak with him about anything at all. Just as I grew dizzy and sensed the arrival of unconsciousness, sound was returned to me. The presence soon left the room, and all the sounds that had once been therein returned resonating as they normally would. I heard the fan, the air conditioning beyond the room, and Jeff's half-crazed whimpering a few feet away. He quickly came to the realization that he could again hear himself, and rose from his crouched position in the corner like a spring let loose. Without thinking, merely happy to have sound re-established, we came together and hugged. I don't mean for this to sound homoerotic, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the sound of his heartbeat when my ear brushed against his chest was perhaps the most wonderful thing I'd ever heard. I held him to me, listened to his heartbeat and his breathing, and he did the same to mine. We only detached ourselves from each other after a few minutes had passed, when those armors of social restraint had returned to us, and we half-heartedly composed ourselves. The hatefulness of before had apparently been swept away by the creeping presence, because I saw only a peer, an associate, a comrade, whatever term you'd like to use, in the man standing beside me. The racist beliefs which I had held seemed so trivial, so arbitrary, when there existed in the same sphere of life as ours some heinous, implacable presence of sound erasure. The thought that mankind put so much effort into racial distinction when invisible presences well beyond our comprehension lurked freely filled me nothing but disgust. I realized at once that the survival of our species depended upon working together, cooperating, if we hoped to resist any similar, planet-wide invasion. Together we left the conference room and investigated the site from which we thought the presence had originated. There, in that end-darkened corridor, we found an open window probably left that way by one of the cleaning personnel. We stared out into the sky, the darkness of night firmly established. Neither of us spoke, but we listened to the sounds of the city, and to the wind, and to the nocturnal animal life as it awakened and hunted. I listened to these things, which wouldn't have been noteworthy on any other night, and found myself impassioned with a desire to protect them at all costs. After a while, we closed the window, and left the building. The presence, whatever it was, had come and gone, and taken my bigotry away with it.